Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. And Mick, thank you so much for making the time to come and do this talk. It's just wonderful to meet you. It really is.
Thanks for having me, mate.
So here we sit in this theatre within an art gallery in an arts precinct by the river in the most beautiful city in Australia. And we can be sure of being safe. There's nobody going to come in bursting in with any type of weapon.
I hope not.
No. But we know that we'll be able to go home and we'll be safe over the next months and years. We're likely to be safe within this world that we generally inhabit. And it's probable that most people in this audience have never actually been in a war zone or had to fight in a war zone. So I wondered if you could just simply set the scene and explain what happens inside your head when you're in the middle of a war zone.
It's a really sounds like a simple question, but it's probably a fairly difficult one. So I had 4 tours of Afghanistan, and each one was, vastly different from the other. They range from being in combat assault teams through to living with a local warlord for a fair while, just myself and another bloke. I think probably there were times where you would hear a gunfight or an ambush start up or spark up, and you would be making your way to that area. And I think you'd be thinking, this is it. This is the last time we're going to do this. This is the last time I'll tighten my helmet strap, or you know what I mean. So I think there's a lot of sort of morbid thought process when you go into that stuff. I think once you accept it, it makes it a lot easier to do it. And that ranged from that to just red hot, searing anger. If you'd had a bloke that had been shot, or you were out to settle a score. So yeah, I think it's a really hard one to answer in a straight way.
Yeah. How long would a tour be?
For us, normally a tour for the regular army, I think, was about 8 months, and at the halfway point you would get a 2-week break in Europe. But I think with special operations, they saved a bit of money and they would send us home a couple of days before the sort of 6-month mark. And then you wouldn't get that break, and you'd turn around and be back 6 months later for another tour.
Right, so you'd stay in Australia for 6 months training,
yes,
and then have to go back to Afghanistan.
Yeah. That was it was a pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you were a Green Beret, a Commando, and I'm sure we understand that as being a very elite soldier. But what does it really mean?
Well, there are 2 sides to the Special Forces. There's a fair few units in it now. So there's the Green Berets, which are the commandos, and then you have the SAS, who are on the West Coast. There's a lot of rivalry between the two. We do, fairly different jobs, and we have different roles to fulfil. We would often go in with a lot more blokes, a lot heavier, and we were there to have a fight. So we were there to get in a stink and rustle up the enemy and like to say, have a bit of fun with them. But it was more, we were the heavy hammer behind the assault force.
You mentioned just now about the red-hot searing anger if one of your friends got wounded or killed. What training was there in the commandos to deal with that type of anger?
Not much. It was probably the reverse. It was, I think I've said it before in interviews, where you would do a course and they'd say it's always about controlled anger. And you'd get to the end of the course and they'd say, you need more anger, you need to be, getting more angry to do the job in a more aggressive manner. And it's a very aggressive role. So, everything from when you raid a house, or if you're on a counter-terrorism domestic job, here in Australia, God forbid, hopefully we never have one, but, you would be grabbing people from their seat by the hair and throwing them on the ground. It's a fairly aggressive role throughout. So I think after a while you absorb a lot of that. It becomes a bit of a bubble compared to the rest of the society, which is probably unhealthy looking back. But at the time, it was, I think, in a lot of senses, what kept me alive.
So in that day that sort of day-to-day behaviour where you're having to be so aggressive. That's your work. How then do you, as mates in the army, how do you deal with each other when you're going back to base, or you're in an area that's somehow a little bit safer so that you can relax a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think blokes can relax. Yeah, but it's just one of those things. It's just a totally different lifestyle. I guess I don't have any analogies to compare it with, but you'd look after one another. But everything they did was, fairly to the maximum. If they trained, they'd train until they were sick. If they, went drinking, they'd drink until they were sick. The whole thing was 100% the whole time, everything they did. So, I just think, and again, looking back, I can still see a lot of blokes that probably haven't dealt. And I say blokes because that's all I've worked around, but they haven't dealt with those issues leaving defence, and perhaps they're caught in a bit of a loop, 5 or 10 years after the job, and they sort of just can't let it go.
Yeah.
So it's pretty sad to see that. So fortunately, I had family where I lived, and close to the base, which is fortunately where I ended up. And in the Commandos, you don't post around the country every 2 years. So I can see how a lot of people that join defence post every 2 years, and they become very insulated by that defence community, so they don't get out, they don't really mingle with people outside of defence. So I think that's probably a big trap.
Yeah. And speaking about that, about the sort of family, well, and in some sort of ways, the family feeling of the army. And here in Australia, I think that there's quite a common sort of image of the sort of perfect mateship is the brotherhood of soldiers. We see it so often with the retelling, particularly of the Anzac legend. So I was wondering about your own experience, the men that you served with, particularly in Afghanistan. Is it a friendship and a mateship that's beyond anything else?
Yeah, it is. Like I have, a small core of friends that I still speak to almost every couple of days. So look, you sort of do anything to help each other out. I think as we've all gotten older, there are blokes that I know that I've tried to help, for so long, and in the end, you can. There's only so much you can do. But I think on a broader scale, they do look after each other. But I would say that a lot of the legends about the Anzacs have morphed into just a whole nother thing over the years, because it's a history we lean on, I guess, probably falsely as a culture to a heavy extent, and I don't think it really fits reality outside of the stories.
Yeah. With your own experience in the army, you've said in different interviews that you described your tour, going on tour and then coming off it, as being a bipolar lifestyle. Can you explain what you meant by that?
So, I can't remember anything I've said. Look, it was a bizarre thing to be in Afghanistan for a period of time, and you get used to living in a certain way, and it's can be a little bit like prison. If you're on the base, you can't just go for a walk. You go to the gym, you're eating, you're training, you're getting ready for the next job, and then when you're home, you'd have a few months off. You'd be going out, having drinks, catching up with family. Still training. It was great, mind you, coming home to train because of the altitude difference. Yes. So you were always fitter. Now I'm getting a lot fatter. Maybe I need a bit more altitude training now. But look, it was just a bizarre lifestyle to be in gunfights and having essentially being the people at night that spook around villages and and waking people up by their bedside, with weapons trained on them, and we were after particular targets to going home and just having this surreal experience coming home where you're safe and you could walk down the street in a pair of board shorts, thongs and a t-shirt and not have to have your pistol, and it'd take 6 months to get used to not always panicking about leaving your pistol somewhere. And then by the time you got back to Afghanistan, you'd be panicking that you've left your phone and your wallet somewhere. So, yeah, so it was this weird, transition.
Yeah.
But I would say in the end, I actually felt more comfortable over there in the fact that it just felt, it was a simpler life. You knew who was having a go at you, you knew what your job was, you knew what you had to do, and then you'd come home and be stuck at what used to be the RTA, the Roads and Traffic Authority, trying to deal with them for 3 hours. You'd just be frustrated, and I think I'd often find myself wishing I was back there.
Do you still?
No.
No.
But with 2 young kids, I think I got more sleep in Afghanistan. So, yeah.
Nice one.
But my wife will attest to that. So.
So you joined the army at 18, straight from school, and you had 1 tour of East Timor.
Yes. Yep.
And then 4 tours of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
After my second last tour of Afghanistan, there was the Black Hawk crash in June 21, 2010. So we lost 3 blokes in that, plus 2 Americans, and fairly catastrophic injuries for the rest of the crew that were in it. I live just down the road from a couple of the mates that were in it and survived. And
how many people were in the helicopter?
I think there was about 12 or 14 people all up.
Why did it crash?
Look, I never really. I'm not one to look backward, but I believe it was pilot error. Flying at altitude in the heat, the helicopters wouldn't have a lot of lift, so we would basically like a roller coaster ride come over the mountains. And as we came over the last one, we were all in a fairly steep dive. There were 4 helicopters, and I remember I was in the back rear left of the helicopter. And I remember I saw the helicopter in front of us, I saw it splash down in the dirt, and I think my eyes wouldn't register what was actually occurring. I was just thinking, that's not the creek where they're supposed to land, because you do fairly significant mission planning and you understand where every other team is to be, and it's very in-depth. And then I realised that dust was coming up, and when the flames started, I'd realised at the time, part of the propeller blade, if that's what it's called, swung past our helicopter, and we sort of aggressively turned off. And but by the time we landed, it was a pretty chaotic scene.
Yeah. So your helicopter landed as soon as it could.
Yeah, we used our helicopter and the other 2 helicopters, as well as impromptu sort of air ambulance. Half of the blokes we threw on we thought were pretty dead by the time we got them on, so there was no real time on the ground to triage. And because of the fire and the intensity of the fire, a lot of the ammunition from the door gunners was cooking off. So not only we were trying to get blokes out, there was indiscriminate sort of fire going everywhere. And there was just real no point taking cover because it was flat ground. And so it was a fairly horrific morning. But I think that's when I started to really I think maybe the movies portray it a little bit strangely, but I think I was just emotionally exhausted was probably the best term for it. I was fairly blank with everything I was doing, and probably fairly dark as well about things. I did another trip in 2011 looking after, or on and off, Rudd, and then later on Gillard. And then I can't remember how many PMs we've had since then, but after that trip, I'd sort of really tried to wean myself off drinking and any of that, and put my hand up and said, look, I need a bit of a respite posting to the training centre. And they just said, do the next trip or we'll fuck you off. And that's more or less the attitude of the day with defence. I think I'd like to say that they've turned it around, but in the space I'm working now, unfortunately, I see probably about 4 or 5 of these sort of similar matters come across every other week. So
it's not necessarily policy then that a soldier who's done a lot of tours through Afghanistan would get, as you say, a respite posting, and they just still wouldn't necessarily follow that protocol.
Defence is an organisation. Now, look, there are things that Defence did in the end to help me in terms of transitioning, but I fought bloody hard to get access to those programs.
Yeah.
But Defence is a very good organisation at creating policy. They have huge policy teams, and I think it becomes more of a hoop to jump through. Just because the policy's there and you're ticking the box doesn't mean that they're actually achieving what the policy is set out to achieve. So I think that's where they fall over. Yeah. And I think when you have an institutionalised organisation like Defence, it's really hard to change the mindset of people who are enforcing that policy.
Yeah. Can you tell me, sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit on what I was going to ask you, but since we've sort of, we're here anyway, I've just find my notes about it. Can you tell me about the extended transition program?
Yeah, look...
So you, at this point, you were thinking of leaving the army?
Yeah.
But it's
well, not thinking,
quite...
I was told that I was out.
Yeah.
And I dug my heels in and said, well, look, I'm not going on a pension for forever.
How old were you at this point?
How old was I, Brooke? 27, something like that, yeah. So I'd been sent home for about 6 months, and they said, see you later, just don't come back into work, we don't want anyone else to get sick. Which I found pretty...
What do they mean by that?
Well, I think mental health at the time was... it was just something you avoided. I think to a large extent it still is. I think they're starting to open up on it. But I found out that there was this program called Extended Transition Program where it would allow someone with injuries to go and study a chosen field of study at university, or now they actually offer trades as well, which I think is a good thing. But you could only really get on if you had someone like the Chief of Army or something pushing for you. And I remember one night I'd had a few beers and I actually called the Chief of Army on his phone and said, yeah, look, basically I've done everything you've ever asked me. I've never been charged. I think it's time you do something for me. And to his credit, he did. So he helped me get on the program. But then, again, the bureaucracy between that Chief of Army and myself, who was Morrison at the time.
Oh, yeah.
The bureaucracy sort of takes over and takes control. And I was told that, not being an officer, it was unlikely that I could, complete a law degree, which fills you with a lot of self-doubt. But...
How much do you think the way that you were treated was also because you weren't an officer?
I think probably the majority of it. I think it's a very antiquated system in terms of how they treat people. Officers still have fairly incredible packages coming out. And look, I have friends who are officers that I've built relationships with since leaving Defence, and even they say that. I think that it's just the way the system's worked forever and a day. And again, a big institutionalised system like Defence, no one seems to question it. Yeah. There were blokes we had having real hard struggles and were in and out of mental health units, and the Army was sort of parking these people in this sort of, this nowhere go sort of position. And I think that's the worst thing for someone with mental health. Yeah, I think they either need to be, and you've got to remember, guys that are in special operations, throughout Australia, they're pretty full-on guys. So, once they commit to something, it's really hard. And when you leave, I always say there was 3 things that I had to deal with, and I don't know if I can remember them, but one, a big part of my struggle transitioning was my identity. I really had that identity crisis. I didn't know who I was, and I think I went to a barbecue once with my wife, and she said, all you talk about is the Army. And I look back and I think that's really all I had to talk about for so long. Like any Olympian, I didn't get any big sponsorship deals, but I spent every living moment of my 20s, committing to this job and this role, and I'd committed essentially to death. I never thought that I'd get past 30 because all my friends were dying around me. So the first one was identity. The second one were my injuries. So I had fairly significant spinal injuries as well, just from abusing my body.
Because you did a lot of parachute jumping as well.
Yeah, we did parachute jumping, carrying up to 65 kilos for hundreds of kilometres over training periods, and taking your socks off and the whole bottom of your sole or your skin would come off, and then you'd tape up and do it again the next day. So you'd be taking all sorts of drugs and medications to keep going. And then the last part was the skill set. So there was nothing that was really transferable. And I'm sad to see that recently the Army's actually dropped its qualification process. So if you join the military and you perhaps fulfil a trade or you get a ticket, it should follow the civilian equivalent. So by the time you leave, you've got that civilian equivalency. Yeah. But for years they would drop short a couple of equivalencies. So if you were leaving and you had, say, 10 or 20 courses, you would have to pay, $1,000 or $2,000 for each one of those courses to complete them. So they create this, this inequity by creating a gap to stop people leaving defence. Yeah. And then in their mind, they lose their investment. And now they've actually dropped their training and assessment qualification altogether. So it's actually left, probably some of the more vulnerable people in the Defence Force in a more vulnerable state.
Yeah. So Mick, at what point? So you're going into the extended transition program, and you're going to study law at the University of Wollongong. At what point did you meet Ben Quilty?
It's a pretty dark few years. So I think it was about 2012. I was in a pretty bad state. I didn't start studying until 2014. Okay. So,
what were you living on at this point? Were you still being paid by the Army?
Yeah, I was just told not to come to work.
For all that time?
Yeah, yep. So, there was a good year and a half there, I think.
Oh, wow.
Actually, we packed our car up and just went around Australia for 4 months.
With no support at all?
Well, look, you talk about mental health, and I didn't have one phone call, one email, one visit, no welfare visits, no padre, no officer. They just said, see you later. And, I think at the time it was if this person does something, then... And now you still see a sense of that in defence. They still try and admin discharge someone or not give them a medical discharge where they're going to have that support of DVA when they leave. So Defence knows, the Army knows. And like I said, I'm not trying to be critical of Defence, but I spend my life now trying to re-engineer people's pathway out to make sure they get the best, the best outcome for themselves and their family, because that's the thing Defence don't think about. That Defence have the data on all these people that are struggling, whereas DVA don't. I think I said to you before, DVA only have data on 1 in 5 veterans. And we have a country with over 1 million veterans. How can that be a justifiable figure that we can put our hand on our heart and say that we're doing everything we can to manage mental health and suicide? Yeah,
it's just so shocking.
Yep.
Yeah, that particular figure. So you're driving around Australia with Brooke, your now wife, and sorry, I don't know whether you were married at the time.
Yeah, no, not at the time.
And
I trapped her later.
And so Ben Quilty's there. He's gone to Afghanistan. He went in 2011, I think.
Yeah.
And so when did you think, oh, this is a guy maybe I should go and visit?
It's a weird story, that one, how I met Ben.
Yeah.
There was this mess. I suppose I've got the microphone, so you're just going to have to listen.
Please.
I was in Dubai at the time, looking after the Prime Minister and members of Parliament. And we were always dressed pretty scruffy, and we didn't really wear, I think we were like the high school kids compared to primary school, sort of beards and looking a bit ruffian. And there was always this old guy. He looked just really, just drawn out and tired and super old. I don't even know how old he is now, but he'll kill me. But he was always eating by himself at the mess, and I walked up to him and a couple swear words and said, no one should have to sit by themselves, mate. Come and join us, And he sort of like hesitated, and I said, don't be a dickhead. Come and join us. And so I was getting stuck into this old guy, and he sits down, and we sit down, and my boss, his jaw nearly hit the floor, and it was the deputy in charge of the whole Australian contingent in the Middle East, and I just thought he was just an old guy in the mess.
Great.
I was, I'd skipped the entry briefs in the country, and and I became really good mates with him.
Yeah.
So
he was probably quite relieved that you were, refreshing and not
I think I
kowtowing to
became
him
his
in a way.
whiskey and wine fixer over there. He knew where to find it always. But no, I'd met John, and he lives not far from Ben, and he said, you've got to go meet this bloke. And
Is this John Oddie?
yes, John, and I didn't know what the Archibald was, or I didn't know much about artists, or other than growing up seeing my mum do a few watercolours.
Oh, great.
So I did a bit of a Google search and thought I'll go up and see this weird dude I had a conversation with on the phone, and that was Ben. So we've been pretty good mates ever since. And
and you sat for him, as you say, you took your kit off for him the first time.
Yeah, it was a bit unnerving.
First time you met.
Yeah, fella gives me a couple of free beers and wants me to get my clothes off. So, I just felt comfortable around him, and I was I was a bit shocked when he asked me, but seeing his studio, and it was his old studio, and seeing some of his work, and he was just he just was a real cool dude. And I think I met him at a good time in my life, because I think I've always had an open mind and an open heart to meet different people. So seeing how Ben and his mates and Guido, other Archibald winner, would catch up and have beers, and just seeing how they viewed the world was a really important thing for me to see, just a different perspective.
Yeah, and I guess literally an eye-opener.
Yep, yeah. So I think at times we'd just be, looking through the window at each other's sort of lives.
Yeah. And you're still friends with Ben?
Yeah,
really good friends?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a few beers about 3 weeks ago or so,
Yes.
but I always regret going up there, because I always have a sore head in the morning. So, but we catch up, and he's got a beautiful little family, and he's sort of seen our kids grow up, and he's even done a few sketches of my wife for her birthday. So when I tell people we've got a couple of quilties up in the house, they don't often believe me, but. I won't give out my address now. But.
No, don't. So Ben Quilty's exhibition after Afghanistan was massive in Australia. It seemed to have a really huge impact. As a veteran yourself, what changes did you see in the way people viewed veterans after that exhibition?
Look, I think it had a huge impact. I think the best thing was he put it front and centre. It wasn't just a landscape. It was... excuse me. It was about the people, and it was about, I guess the reality of what these people are dealing with. And he was a first mover there, so I think it made a lot of people take notice.
Yeah.
Although I think the interest has waned a little bit now, but I hope that we can keep pushing and keep it in the everyone's, the front of their minds, that people are still struggling. There are tens of thousands of veterans that have served now, and many of them are still struggling with coming to terms with what they've been through or experienced.
Yeah. When you see that portrait that's on display here, Baino after Afghanistan, and you see yourself, in that almost like in a sort of supplicant position in this terrible kind of darkness.
Yeah.
And your bare skin that's only the canvas, it's just the linen.
Yeah.
Your actual chest here.
Yeah.
And your whole face is just this complete and utter torment of different colours.
I was losing my hair.
Yeah.
Receding hairline, just like you showed it up.
So when you see that Baino and now you look at yourself now. I mean, look at you. You're so handsome. You're glowing with health. You've got clear eyes.
Thanks,
You know, you look fantastic.
Yeah, look, it
The,
was...
the two, I mean, it's an incredible difference. What do you think now when you look at that portrait?
It's pretty embarrassing, like really.
Right.
And some of the other paintings, you know, I always say, you know, for a world-class artist, he wasn't very good at painting the scale, but I think he showed really how I was feeling. It's quite confronting looking back at it, and I think that was the sort of time where I was really at rock bottom, and everything from then has been, you know, post, you know, that time. So, I thought I was more tan than that one he showed.
But you were tanned in the bits that would have been exposed, I suppose, in Afghanistan.
Look, it is. I think most people have had the same response. So
yeah, it's an incredible picture.
Thanks, mate.
Yeah. So let's talk about your work now. So you got a major scholarship at the University of Wollongong. You didn't only just pass your degree when everybody thought that you weren't going to, but you flew it, like you totally aced it. Got this major scholarship.
Yeah.
And now, what are you doing with your law practice?
Well, when I had initially applied, I applied for law, and then I just thought I wasn't going to get in. And I applied for commerce, and the uni wrote back and said, "Congratulations, you got into law commerce." So I sort of shrugged and went, "Well, I guess I'll just do both of them." And, but yeah, I've kicked off a law practice in Wollongong. We're backed by a significantly large mid-tier firm called Robert McClellan and Brown, who, interestingly enough, have a bit of a war history themselves. They actually had some of their founding elders there were involved in the criminal war trials against the Japanese in Papua New Guinea.
Is that Robert McClellan, who used to be the Attorney General?
No, different one. Yeah,
right.
But so the managing director, a guy by the name of Craig Osborne, he backed me. He invested in me, and myself and another friend. We've come along, and we've kicked off a firm. We do a lot of corporate and business work, which I really enjoy. And we cater for veterans, first responders, because I think they're a forgotten entity out there a lot of the times, and their families.
Yeah.
So
when you say first responder, that you're literally going as the first responder to.
No, we're looking after veterans and police, fireys, ambos, prison guards.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So I think for a long time, coming from the other side, I want to try and address and change the way a lot of law firms operate. And everything's not about the hourly rate or the bottom dollar. It's about, I'd probably be shot for saying it, but it's just the service industry, and they have to get back to the basics and start looking after people. Yeah. So
with the veterans in particular that you work with, obviously not talking about any specific cases, but in general, what kind of issues are you seeing that you need to help people with?
A lot of people with, mental health issues. There was a local barrister that, while I was studying and at the firm, assisted him with a couple hundred criminal veteran matters. We've had no one come back for another bite. So I think once they have that bit of support, it helps push them back into the community and might wake them up a little bit. We deal with a lot of defence matters where people have been abused. Unfortunately, it's an organisation that just is always in the spotlight. You've got to look at the tens of thousands of child apprenticeships that Defence had between the 40s and the 90s, which make up around a quarter of the victims from the child sex abuse inquiries. You've got to look at the sexual assaults. And
sorry to interrupt. Was that something that was particularly talked about?
Look, I think it was raised.
Right.
I think Defence seems to always, in my day-to-day now, seem to be at the centre of things. They've had the DLA Piper reviews. They've released Volume 1. Parliament or the Senate wouldn't release Volume 2, which names 900 more sexual assault and serious assault victims in Defence. you know, it's disappointing that they're not more transparent with the public about that sort of stuff. And I know there's been calls for royal commissions into, and these are my own personal views, into DVA, the Veteran Affairs. I think Veteran Affairs have moved leaps and bounds in the last 5 years under Liz Cosm, the Secretary of Veteran Affairs. They've got a long way to go, like, don't get me wrong. They've got to change the way they operate, and again, you know, start following the model litigant rule and looking after their people they're supposed to be, because, you know, the compensation is often far below what they'll actually spend on legal services.
That figure that you gave before of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the DVA only knowing or only having the information of 1 in 5 veterans, that it strikes me as being extraordinarily passive.
It is. Again, you've got two separate organisations. So Defence will have someone who will discharge. They won't necessarily have that aftercare. Look, I understand Defence is about fighting wars and being prepared, but there's also a large element of their workforce who are injured, and they're probably one of the only organisations that doesn't have to do anything. And I think some of that will change with the inquiries that are coming out, the Cornell inquiry and the Productivity Commissioner inquiry. I think the government just needs to improve the way they operate rather than scrap the system. And I think Defence, you know, to a large extent, need to be held to account. You've got organisation Defence that sits parallel to DVA, and most of the staff that run DVA are former Major Generals from Defence. So if you've got a system in Defence that doesn't work, you can't just translate that by putting a factory model officer straight into another role. There are so many people in the public sector that could do the role probably better and have a better understanding of health and where people are and what they need. Yeah.
And Mick, I know this is a really huge question, but what's your personal opinion about the $500 million that's been touted for the additions to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra? Do you think that's the best use of that money?
I don't. I think it comes back to spending the money on programs for veterans. I think that memorials and, you know, those commemorations that the War Memorial holds are very important, but I think as a nation we spend far too much on commemorating you know, those long time wars. We can spend a lot more of that money on things that are going to benefit the community and the veteran community, because it's not just veterans, it's their families.
You were saying earlier about, was it European countries, was it even Great Britain, where they spend a certain amount per deceased soldier? Yeah,
for an average World War I veteran from England, they'll spend about $8, whereas we spend about $8,800 per World War I dead. So I think when the figure pales in comparison, I think we really need to do more. There's been, you know, Tony Abbott signed off on new museums and memorials in France, and I think, again, they're great. Maybe I'm just jealous because I haven't been to visit yet. But look, on all accounts, everyone said they're amazing, but it's hell of a lot of money to spend when we've got this issue with suicide and mental health injuries. And I always call them injuries, not mental health illness. So because injuries is more akin to how they've received them.
Are there any countries which do a good job in this regard?
Look, I'm not saying that our system is actually one of the better systems. It just needs revamping. The first access point for any former serving member or serving member is to go to an advocate run by RSL, or a series of other ex-service organisations, and they're an ageing group, they're an ageing membership. RSL New South Wales has 35,000 members, and the average median age is about 77.
Oh, God.
So, and when I was the state vice president, I realised that we had a big issue, and it's going to be a big thing to turn around. But they need to, and what I'm working on with the firm and groups like another veteran business with me, with a fellow by the name of Tom Moore, who's doing great things for veterans and getting employment, is looking at professionalising and automating a lot of that advocacy service, where it's a very complex system. There's lots of legislation to go through, and if someone makes a mistake because they're managing too many people or they can't keep up with the legislative or policy changes, then that veteran can potentially be stuck in no man's land for a period of years. So if we can mitigate that issue by automating a lot, still have the advocates there to be that human element, then I think it'll be a better system for it.
Yeah. So Mick, you and your wife have two beautiful children, 4 and 2, I think you said at the moment. When they reach, let's say, 18...
They won't be joining defence.
Well, I was going to say, they turn to you and they say, Dad, I want to join the army. What are you going to say to them?
Let's go and change the will. No, look, I had a good career, but unfortunately, look, I have lots of mates that have had a great career, but it was something I always wanted to do, but it was also because I didn't have a lot of options at the time. I've truly, and it maybe sounds a bit weird because I don't think I've said it before, I've seen the horrors of a place like that. And unfortunately, I've seen that it's also, unfortunately, an organisation that doesn't really have much aftercare for its people. So, I've dealt with, young females that have been raped in defence, and defence just drop the charges and wash it away. Any organisation that can allow that to happen in today's day and age to any person that puts their life on the line and risks life and limb, they really don't deserve they don't deserve to have them. And I don't think that if they can't be transparent about it, if they made big changes, then perhaps I'd look at it. And I know that's a strategic issue for them in the future, but we've got ministers and teams that get paid a lot of money to sort these issues out. But it seems to be the one organisation that is beyond reproach in terms of government.
Yeah. And would you say culturally as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm often not sure if the department works for the PM or the PM works for the department. I know it's a pretty intense view, but I haven't seen a minister stand up to him since probably Kim Beazley's era. Yeah.
We're going to go to audience questions in just a moment. Michaela's here with the mic. But Mick, I just wanted to ask you finally, you've said in previous interviews that you're one of the lucky ones.
Yeah.
You're alive and you have this beautiful family. Your wife is here. She's clearly an exceptional woman. So is the war over for you now?
I didn't pay him. Yeah, look, it certainly is. Look, I am lucky. I've got a beautiful wife, beautiful kids. Other than lack of sleep for the both of us right now, it's been an amazing journey. I think my transition's been made easier because I had an open heart and I've had fantastic mentors around me, and I've been open to different experiences and letting these people help me along and taking their advice on board. But yeah, my war's certainly over. But unfortunately, I've got a business that could be sustained purely off the work that we've spoken about tonight. So if that was it'd be the feather in the cap. So
yeah, thanks, Mick.